Thank you very much, Professor Esposito. It is really a privilege to be in this room with, as I mentioned earlier to Professor Vol, people I read prior to even my undergraduate studies, really eminent scholars that I have a lot of great respect. I've read a lot of your works, Professor Esposito, Professor Tamara Soon, Professor John Vol, Professor Brown, of course, my good friend, Professor Lily Rahim, who's really a source of inspiration, especially on the Singaporean side of things. Now, the work, my presentation, this is a work in progress. I'm still, grappling with the ideas that, and also the conceptual framework in terms of how I want to frame this. It's a larger project looking comparatively at Islamophobia in three different countries, so India, Myanmar, and Malaysia. So Malaysia is, of course, often a surprise because why would you have Islamophobia in a Muslim-majority country? I think you do have Islamophobia. And the sort of argument that I'm putting forth is that there has been attempts in all three states to create, the idea of a homogeneous nation. The nation-building process itself is one where, a particular strand of religious identity in particular is being built. And what is interesting is that regardless of the religious tradition that is actually being employed, the outcome of it is fairly similar in all three cases. I'm also sort of looking at this. The reason why I'm looking at all these three countries is because of the history of British colonial rule. And I think that has a major, it's a major factor in terms of how we look at the expressions of Islamophobia, or how nations itself, all three nations, have tried to define itself over the years. And this is something I appreciate, some of your views from. Now, the presentation today is based on fieldwork that I did this year and late last year. And it was interviews I conducted, over 40 interviews with both Muslim political, or rather Muslim leaders, Indian Muslim leaders, as well as Hindu nationalist figures. And I have to say that it is perhaps, I've done work in some difficult countries like Pakistan. I've published on Pakistan. But India was really the most difficult country I had to work with. Having my name, Nawab Osman, which is a very South Asian Muslim name, really shut a lot of doors for me. I had a lot of problems accessing people, even when they agreed, okay, we're going to meet you, they don't actually meet me. And funny story, and I have to say that I'm coming in a very insider-outsider perspective. I read an article about the RSS, which many of you are familiar with. It is basically the ideological parent organization of the current ruling government. And I read about how the RSS had a strong presence. In fact, the second largest sort of RSS base is in a place called Mangalore in the south of India. So much of South India and Maharashtra, the spread of Hindu nationalism occurred through Mangalore. And it was done primarily through a community called the Gawat Saraswat Brahmin, which is basically a Kashmiri Brahmin group that escaped Muslim persecution. I'm married to a GSB. And so immediately I joked with my wife and said that, I always knew you're a bit of a Hindu fundi. And she made a couple of calls. And before I know it, I was actually in the office of the RSS in Mangalore with the head of RSS in Mangalore, which is a very important group, but also the head of the BJP and so on. So at the end of the meeting, most of you will be familiar with this idea of love jihad. So I was saying, look, I was very nervous about coming here because I would be accused of being a love jihadi. And the response was that, no, you're all right. You're quite, you're the good Muslim. And what is interesting during some of these interviews is how I would say that, when we look at Islamophobia as well as the idea of Hindutva, we tend to look at it from a very homogeneous perspective. And I think both at a policy level and an academic level, there's a need for us to nuance it. Because the way they stand, the way they look at things, the way the narrative actually takes place is quite different. And how Muslims, and the point I want to make today, is that the experience of Islamophobia by Muslims in India is varied. All Muslims are impacted by Islamophobia, but the experiences itself is very much mitigated by a lot of different circumstances. So I mentioned, about my methodology and conceptual approach. Now, the first idea I want to sort of, discuss is the confluence between Hindutva and Islamophobia. Now, so most of the writings on Indian Muslim or Hindu Muslim relations have sort of focused on the Hindu nationalist narrative as a phenomenon that occurred after the partition of India. But rather, when we actually look at the literature itself, I actually realized that this notion of winners or this Hindu nationalism itself can be traced back to a lot of the Orientalist writing. So to quote David Luden and Arjuna Padurai, they argued that that nationalism is not an answer to Orientalism. On the contrary, nationalism is the avatar of Orientalism in the colonial and post-colonial periods. They further explained that one of the most fundamental contributions of the Orientalist discourse was the essentialization of Hindu-Muslim conflict, and that the construction of the category of Hindu as a well-bounded cultural category by Orientalists really divided the Indian society into groups, namely Hindus and non-Hindus. Now, these divided section societies were then strategically essentialized by Orientalists and later institutionalized in the nationalist political representation leading up to the partition in 1947. So Thomas Bloom Hansen, another leading scholar on religious and political violence in India, argued that the otherization of Muslim or Islamophobia in India was a consequence of the Orientalist ideas that were constructed as early as the 1700s. In his work, he argued that in order to codify Hinduism or Hindu culture, early Oriental scholars attempted to abstract a core central tenet in scripture from their encounter with vast corpus of religious images, myths, and practices in the subcontinent. This resulted in the construction of classical Hinduism as a unified religious civilization, which was born from the supposition of a common ancient text, the Vedas, followed by a common caste culture, the Aryan race, knit together by a common language, Sanskrit, and sanctified by a sacred geography inscribed by centers of pilgrimage all over the Indian subcontinent. And any belief that did not fit the ethos of classical Hinduism was deemed as foreign. Now, post-1800s, a number of the nationalist movements that drew inspiration from the Indo-Orientalist presumptions about India was backed by newfound Brahmanical authority, and this was a theme that I constantly encounter time and time again, this notion of Brahmanical authority and rule. And the founders of Hindu revivalism, including Ram Mohan Roy, Swami Vivekananda, who had privy to British education and political dogma, used this Indo-Orientalist ideology to develop an anti-colonial Hindu nation. Now, however, the unity of the Hindus was built on a conservative symbolic level, which explicitly drew boundaries between Hindus or us on the one hand, and Muslims and Christians on the other hand. Now, in colonial India, in the context of India, the assimilation of the Indo-Orientalist discourse gave idea to this notion of a homogeneous Hindu nation. But it's only the perceived threat, real or imagined, to the homogeneous nation that give rise to communalism and Islamophobia. And this theme, actually, if we actually look at the context of Myanmar, for example, you can see a very similar construction of that idea of the Buddhist nation. Similarly, in Malaysia, the dichotomy that was drawn between the Malays and the Chinese in particular, but also the other races, was also made very clear. And so attempts were made by certain groups in Malaysia to try to build that homogeneous Muslim nation over a period of time. And Lili Zubaida, of course, has written extensively on this. Now, so as I've said, there's also a need, I think, to dichotomize between the idea of Hindutva and Islamophobia. There has been, and in my interviews with Indian Muslim leaders, often they equate the two. Now, not all Hindutva is about Islamophobia. Not all Islamophobia is about Hindutva, because as some of the Indian Muslim leaders that I I interviewed argued that this notion of Islamophobia is more widespread. It's not just an agenda that's been pushed for by Hindu nationalists. Often, many of the leftist secular individuals or parties and so on are also involved in Islamophobia, perhaps without an agenda. But many of the policies that they push through are Islamophobic in nature as well. Now, to move on. So there is a certain assumption, I think, in the current writings on Indian Muslim that there is a homogeneous Indian Muslim identity, which of course is untrue. I mean, there is massive cleavages in terms of language, ethnicity, and so on, sectarian differences, gender, and so on. And as a result, their Islamophobic experience is the same. So we hear, for example, about the expression of Islamophobia, in various ways. As I've said, Islamophobia impacts all Muslims, but its impact is mediated by cleavages of ethnicity, sect, gender, class, and region. So you'd find, for example, in the southern part of India, that Islamophobia is perhaps less of an issue, or the expression of Islamophobia is different, or people tend to be a lot more tolerant, if you like, of the differences. So people might be more relaxed about jokes being made about Hinduism or about Islam within the context of society, within the context of political organizations and so on. Whereas in the north, in much of the north of India, I think many of these things are considered a lot more sensitive. So I think the expression of it is different. Now, contemporary Islamophobia in India, it's been argued to be a post-BJP. So since the BJP government took over in the 1990s, that you begin to see an expression of Islamophobia. But really, I think the second term of the BJP in 2014 was really when we see a lot more policies, a lot more attempts, a lot more actions carried out by various groups in India in support against Muslims and so on. So how is this expressed? I think through violence, actual violence. So you have the instances of cow lynching, for example, people who apparently were killed because they were suspected to be involved in the cow trade. By the way, there is a certain level of truth. Part of the problem, I think, in some parts of India was that there was theft happening. People were stealing cows. I don't know how you steal a cow, but apparently you can. And the Indians have a way of doing, working around these things. And so that has led to a certain perception that Muslims, are involved in these sort of illegal activities. Curtailment of rights. This we have seen with the new citizenship law that was passed recently, which will now allow many refugees from countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh who are of non-Muslim background. So if you're Christian, Jain, Hindu, you would have access to Indian citizenship if you have lived in India for about 6 years. With a clear exclusion for the Muslims. So if you are a Muslim who is persecuted in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, Narendra Modi argued that essentially you can get asylum in Muslim majority countries, so you don't need India to be the big brother, which of course tells us as well the transnational dimension of the Hindutva movement. My primary work that I do is really on Southeast Asia. So one example that I can cite is in the island of Bali in Indonesia, where you actually have a Hinduism that's practiced that is completely different from Indian Hinduism. But over the years, in the last 8 years or so, there's been an attempt by a number of individuals, including a politician by the name of Arya Widakarna, who has employed the anti-Muslim narrative that in India within the context of Bali. So, and it's also interesting because he's also trying to transform Balinese Hinduism to make it more akin to Hinduism. Indian Hinduism, and that included building a temple, mandir, which is different from the Balinese pura. That includes the celebration of Diwali, for example, that has traditionally never been celebrated in Bali, and includes various narrative of how wearing the hijab. He called for the ban of the hijab because it does not reflect Balinese culture. Very similar again to the narrative you find in India. And interestingly, of all things, he called for the ban of cow slaughter during Eid al-Adha. Again, it's problematic because the Balinese Hindus all eat beef. right? Often during Eid al-Adha, Balinese Hindu leaders would sacrifice cows or donate cows to Muslim community. But we can see again that he's again being funded by the BHP and have very strong ties to the RSS. So I think this transnational dimension of Hindu nationalism and perhaps even Buddhist nationalism is something that we need to better understand. Of course, Bollywood is another instrument utilized by the Hindu nationalists. Here you have a very infamous or famous movie. I've got some screenshots from it. It's called Padmavat. The portrayal of Alauddin Khilji, who was a Delhi, was part of one of the sultans of the Delhi Sultanate, was that he was barbaric, that he was this, sex-crazed individual who liked both men and women, and he was very anti-Hindu, he was very violent and so on. And this is just one example. I can name you, every year probably there are a dozen, if not several dozen movies that really promote Islamophobia in the worst way possible. So even when, the portrayal of Muslims in Bollywood, for example, even when it's supposed to be, it's not supposed to be Islamophobic, is always this kind, weak uncle of sorts. The term often being the name that's being used is Rahim Chacha, Uncle Rahim, that weak Muslim who's a nice guy and so on, but stupid and, not done very much of his life. So we can see the discourse happening in various ways. Now I'm going to now move on to look at, so I've chosen the examples of 5 Muslim leaders for various reasons, one of which I think they represent different segments of the Muslim population, but also the fact that these are influential individuals who have made a difference, I think, both in the political, social, and religious realm. And it's interesting, one would have thought that given their background that they would have agreed a lot more with various dimensions of the Hindutva and Islamophobia, but that's not quite the case, as I'm going to show in a while. So Asaduddin Owaisi is the leader of an old Hyderabad-based party, the Majlis Ittihadul Muslimin, the MIM. So they emerged out of the police action that was taken place in the state of Hyderabad by the Indian government. Many of them were descendants of Hyderabadi aristocrats. And what has happened is that he's trained, he's a barrister that's trained in the UK. He has tried to present the MIM essentially as a party for Muslims. He's argued that essentially, that the Hindutva is actually has been promoted by all political parties. So Islamophobia is an outcome of Hindutva politics of all shades. This includes how he described the Congress Party of India, which he argues to employ soft Hindutva. That if you actually look at the policies of the Congress Party, the example he cited was how Rajiv Gandhi, the former Prime Minister of India, how he ordered the locks of the Babri Masjid to be removed, as an example of that. And so he argues that, all major political parties contribute to Islamophobia and use the Muslim whipping boy in order to consolidate or to capture the Hindu votes. So what were his ideas or his key strategies in terms of how, he would counter Islamophobia? So he argued that there's a need for Muslims to take ownership of their politics, that Muslims need to represent themselves, of course, through the MIM, and they need to stand against Hindutva and Islamophobia at the political level. They also need to ensure that Muslim votes are not a blank check for secular parties. So what secular parties, he argued, have been doing is that over the years, they have been using the threat of Hindu nationalism to try to capture the Muslim vote. Essentially, you need to vote for us. If not, you have the big bad Hindu nationalist wolf coming along. He argued, so a lot of questions have been posed to Asaduddin Owaisi because Muslims do not constitute, a strong enough group within political group in India for him to really form a government anywhere, even at the state level. So his argument is that he wants to put one representative from the MIM in every state assembly. And he basically uses the Muslim vote. He said that you can use the Muslim vote in a very clever way to try to get secular parties and even the BJP to try to change his policies on a number of fronts. And one of the strategies of Owaisi, which of course has been problematic is to form alliances, political alliances, with other victims of Hindutva politics, such as the Dalits. So in the recent election at the state level in a state called Maharashtra, where Mumbai is, he tried to form an alliance which didn't quite work out. Now, another individual, Salman Khurshid, who is really the face of Indian Muslims within the Congress Party, former Minority Affairs Minister, former Foreign Minister, of India under the previous government. He basically argued that you need to build a broad-based secular alliance in terms of overcoming Islamophobia and Hindutva. Sorry, one point I want to mention: Owaisi essentially equates Hindutva with Islamophobia. As far as this is concerned, he doesn't equate. Sorry, he argues that Hindutva plus really contributes to Islamophobia. Now, Salman Khurshid, on the other hand, argues that Hindutva is really the politics of the Sangh Parivar. Sangh Parivar refers to the collective Hindu nationalist groups, the BJP, RSS, and others. He believes that Islamophobia is only limited to Sangh Parivar members, and he renders Muslim as invisible citizens, as a result of Islamophobia. He has argued that essentially Muslims today in India, and I think there is some level of truth, that they have become, they are worried about their position within Indian society, and they are basically arguing, they are trying to de-emphasize their Muslimness as a result of this, and so you don't actually see that Muslimness of the Muslims in public. Now, a key strategy is building a broad-based alliance with the Hindu majority. So we believe that in order for you to overcome Islamophobia, you need to work with the Hindus, support for Indian secularism, and of course support for the Congress Party that he argued has been the bastions of secularism in India, and also the people who have stood by the Muslims throughout the Indian history. Of course, this has been contested by people like Owaisi, arguing that really the Muslim political empowerment, social empowerment, even economic position have not improved. In fact, have deproved over the years of Congress rule in India. Now, this man is perhaps the most interesting of all the five that I'm going to discuss. So Dr. Majid Ahmed is basically a central committee member of a group called the Muslim Manch Rashtriya. Now, the MMR was formed basically in 2002 as a Muslim wing of the RSS. So believe it or not, the Hindu nationalists think that, there's a need for them to reach out to Muslims. So, for various reasons, but mainly because of political reasons. So, the Muslim Manch Rashtriya has a membership of about 50,000. He himself is a very famous surgeon. He's a special cancer specialist. I've interacted with him a number of times. He's a very pious man. He would not miss his prayers. His wife wears the hijab. So he would not really be an example of someone you would assume to be associated with Hindu nationalists. But the narrative of Dr. Majid is extremely interesting because he argues that Islamophobia today is the result of Muslim subjugation of Hindus. That basically the Muslims did a lot of bad things over the years. He cited how Muslims destroyed thousands of temples, places of worship, looted, Hindus, forcibly convert Hindu women, and ruled India for 1,000 years. And they did a lot of bad things. So he's arguing essentially that there's a need to acknowledge historical misdeeds of what the Muslims did. He argues that you need to accept majoritarian rule. So the way he described this is that the Hindus and Muslims, they constitute a part of the Indian nation, and the Hindus are bigger brothers to Muslims. And what is interesting is that how he cited hadiths of the Quran and the Quran to justify this. So one good example of this, his justification for Hindus as the big brothers and why you need to listen to them is that in Islam, he quoted a hadith arguing that you need to love the younger ones and respect the elders. He also argued that, you should, for example, so when I asked him about the Babri Masjid, he argued that, look, in Islam anyway, you're not allowed to pray in a location where you have idols. So this place had idols. So why would you want to pray there in the first place? Let them have it. You can, there's no restriction on you building a lot of mosques. Professor Jonathan Brown probably could have addressed that in different ways on how wrong he is with regards to his hadith interpretation. But nonetheless, this is actually being used, and these people believe in it. Be aware that So another argument that's being put forth is that he argued that secular parties have essentially used Muslims without delivering development. So he cited examples, and he took me to a number of offices of local legislative assemblymen, where he highlighted to me how in many of these areas, the majority of people who are seeking help from the local MLA are all Muslims. There is some level of truth. I don't know whether he brought me to places where there are more Muslims, but this is basically the argument. It's fine, you can basically accept majoritarian rule, but you will also have development, right? Muslims will be able to have good education, safety, and so on. And basically recognize that Hindutva can deliver economic upliftment for Muslims. That yes, in certain fronts you might have to listen to your big brother, but in many other fronts you will benefit economically. And so this is interesting to note. Now, one of the argument that's being put forth in some of the more journalistic pieces that have come out is how many of the BJP itself is utilizing gaps within the Muslim community to try to essentially promote their agenda. They have argued essentially Shiites and some Sufis in particular are more inclined to join the BJP, which is really not true, because what I found with the Muslim Manch Rashtriya is that they have a whole lot of people from different backgrounds, all being able to justify their positions accordingly. Now, Maulana Arshad Madani, he is one of the most important religious scholars in the country, head of the Darul Ulum Deoband, which is one of the most famous madrasas in the country. He's also the leader of the Jama'ati Ulama Hind. So he basically has been one of the voices speaking out against Islamophobia and the Hindutva. So he argued much like the Congress Party, and I think we need to also know that historically the JUI has had a sort of an alliance with the Congress. You have had JUI ulamas who have run on the ticket of the Congress Party and so on. So you can see that the rhetoric is very similar to that of Salman Khurshid. So Islamophobia is a result of some Parivar's attempt to establish Hindutva by creating tensions between Muslims and Hindus. Again, he argued that the vast majority of Hindus are not Islamophobic. Now, he argues essentially part of the problem of Islamophobia in India is that the territorial nationalism, and this was an idea that was promoted by the founder of the Jama'ati Ulama Hind, where they argued that the basis of territory should be the basis of Muslims and Hindus coming together. It does not matter whether they are of different religions, but they are part of the same kaum or group. Essentially, he argues that the idea of India is in danger. Fears are being expressed about the constitution, and innocent people are being killed. Now, and he also argues that the situation is a lot worse than what was seen right after partition. And again, his proposed strategies for overcoming Islamophobia is to support the Indian constitution. And being an alim, he argues also that this is a test from Allah, that you need to adhere better to Islam, as a way to counter Islam. The last individual that I am looking at, Irfan Engineer, is the director of the Center for Society and Secularism. Now, he's the son of the very famous Ashgar Ali Engineer, who was one of the key individuals calling for the reformation of the Dawoodi Bohra community, but also a very important voice for Indian Muslims, also a very important voice for Islamic reformism in the Muslim world. He argued Islamophobia, of course, is the outcome of the rise of Hindutva, but also the Wahhabization of Indian Muslims. So over the years, he argued that there has been, all these individuals who went to the Gulf states, they come back, they build mosques, they actually promote the ideas of Wahhabism, and that has led to a more exclusive Muslim community, which he argued has fed into the rhetoric of the Hindu nationalists. So his proposal is to counter Islamophobia in partnership with secular forces but also to mobilize against the export of Wahhabism to India and enhance the Indian Muslim tradition of Sufi Islam. So one of the arguments he put forth is that, how one of the BJP's argument is that both Muslims and Christians are basically foreign. They are foreigners, their religions are foreign. But he argued that there has always been, when you look at Sufi Islam, which is the predominant Islam in India, that there's always been an appreciation for the local dynamics. So he quoted how Iqbal, for example, referred to Ram, the Lord Ram, as the Imam-e-Hind, or the Imam of India, how Nizamuddin Chishti began his day with bhajans or Hindu rituals. And Indian secularism, he argued, should be about giving equal space to all religions, not to give space to religious fundamentalism, that he equates here with Wahhabism and Hindutva. So what does this all mean? So essentially, the point that I wanted to make is how Islamophobia in India is complex. It is not, much of the writings have tried to essentially create this homogeneity of Islamophobia. And just when you look at the Indian Muslim leadership alone, you can see a multitude of different positions and thinking on the issue, and they actually contest each other, even with regards to how to deal with Hindutva and Islamophobia. So in some cases, there's been an equation of Hindutva with Islamophobia, such as in the case of Maulana Arshad Madani and Salman Khurshid. In other cases, Asaduddin Owaisi, for example, argues that there has been a larger Islamophobic discourse within India from both supposed secular parties and Hindu nationalist groups. And many of their positions are shaped by, of course, religious and political positions. So Irfan Engineer promotes a more reformist Islam, a more liberal Islam, and argues essentially the bigger problem is Wahhabism. Whereas in the case of the Deobandis, for example, and he also, for example, referred to how Deobandi Islam is not exactly healthy for India, because it promotes extremism and support for terrorism and so on. And the other issue is about the fact that the whole issue of credibility to define and shape strategies with regards to this. Who really speaks up for the Indian Muslims? Who is the voice who really is that credible voice? So some have argued that, and some have referred to Asaduddin Owaisi, if you like, similar to Jinnah, the sole spokesman of Indian Muslims today. And when I asked him whether this is the case, he said no. In fact, he doesn't even aspire to be an Indian Muslim leader. I think clearly understanding that that position itself would have been extremely problematic. Now, the bigger problem, I think, for Indian Muslims is the fact that these cleavages are being used very intelligently by BJP and RSS to highlight contradictions of the Muslim position and employ strategies of further dividing them. So, for example, Maulana Arshad Madani met the head of the RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, and that created a whole rupture within Indian society, Indian Muslim society in particular. Many of the Congress individuals felt that this was an attempt for the RSS to gain legitimacy for itself. The fact that a very senior ulama would meet the head of the RSS, and later on, everything that Maulana Madani had to say was constructed as him being now an apologist for the RSS. Similarly, the Asaduddin Owaisi have been referred to as the Team B of the BJP by the Congress and others, people like Irfan Engineer, for example, because whenever, the argument is that the MIMs really divide the Muslim votes. So when the Muslim votes are divided, the Hindu nationalists have a fairly good chance to win. And similarly, Irfan Engineer have been referred to as not being a Muslim at all, because he's a liberal Muslim who his wife is Hindu, and he does not have the credibility to speak for Islam. And this obviously creates a lot more problems. So what I'm trying to do, is really to try to nuance the whole dynamics of Islamophobia in India, to look also at where the gaps are within and the cleavages are within the Indian Muslim community. I hope part of this will go into my book, and I really welcome your comments, and questions. Thank you very much.